In this video we shall discuss how to use triggers to control data modification. In the first task we have to create a trigger to prevent the following situations with subscriptions. So the operation should be aborted if subscription start date is in the future or subscription end date is in the past, that's for insert operations only, or subscription's end date is less than subscription start date. This is how the expected result looks like. The transaction should be aborted on attempt to violate any condition mentioned in the task. And also an appropriate message should be displayed. Here are some examples of such messages, but of course you may use your own format. As usual, we are starting with MySQL, and now we have to mention that from now on we shall omit delimiter modification expressions and so on. You may see previous videos for those details. The first trigger we have to create should react to insert operations. According to the task, we have three conditions: 1, 2, 3. That's why in the trigger body we have to check all those three conditions. Here they are. And if any condition is violated, we have to prepare our final message. Here it is. And then in each case we have to execute such a command. All these commands raise an exception, an error situation, and in such a case MySQL aborts the transaction. Then we have to create a trigger that reacts to update on this table. According to the task, this second condition is for insert operations only, that's why it's not here. So we only have blocks of code for the first and the third conditions. And these blocks of code are exactly the same as in the previous trigger. Here we are checking those conditions, then we are composing the final error messages, and then we are raising an error, and that forces MySQL to abort the whole transaction. As usual, please create such triggers in your DBMS and write some queries to test them. With Microsoft SQL Server we may follow several approaches. With the first approach, we shall block the whole transaction regardless of how many good or bad records are there. So we have to create a trigger that reacts to insert and update operations. Obviously, we don't need a delete trigger here because it's impossible to violate any rules from the task during delete operation. And so we have to do the following. We have to declare two variables to store bad records list and to store our message. Then we have to compose the list of bad records. And the list of these bad records will correspond to the first condition. Then we are checking how many records are in that list. If the length of that string is greater than 0, that means that there are some records violating that rule. And in such situation we have to compose our final message, we have to raise an error, and then we have to roll back the whole transaction. Then we have to declare two variables to store the count of deleted and inserted records, and here how we calculate those numbers. Then we have to compose a list of records violating the second rule. And as the second rule is for insert operation only, we have to be sure that the deleted records count is 0 and inserted records count is greater than 0. And then we have to check the length of this list. If the length of this list of that string is greater than 0, that means that we have to compose our final message, raise an error, and roll back the transaction. Then we have to compose the list of records violating the third condition. And once again, if this string length is greater than 0, that means that we have to compose our final message, to raise an error, and to roll back the whole transaction. But in Microsoft SQL Server we may follow another approach that blocks only bad records, allowing good records to be processed normally. Here we are declaring three variables to store a list of records violating each of those rules. Then we have to store the list of good records and we have to store our message. Then we have to compose lists for the first rule, here it is, for the second rule, here it is, and for the third rule, here it is. And if at least one of those rules is violated, we have to produce our final message, we have to raise an error, and then we have to proceed with the following operations. We have to check, are there any good records? If there are, we have to perform the insert operation manually. So we have to allow the insertion on identity fields, we have to calculate the value of the auto-incremented primary key in case it's not passed to the query explicitly, then we have to perform the insert operation, and we have to turn the identity insertion off. Finally, we only have to mention that some records were processed successfully, and that's all. And once again and again, please create all these triggers and write some queries to test how those triggers work. With Oracle, we shall follow MySQL approach. We use row-level triggers here, and the first trigger will react to insert operation on subscriptions table. Here are blocks of code for our first, second, and third conditions from the task. And once any condition is violated, we have to create our final message, and then we have to execute such a command. And that command will not only raise an error, but will also block the transaction in Oracle. The next trigger will react to update operation. Because here we do not need this condition checking, we only have blocks for the first and the third conditions. And so, if corresponding rule is violated, we have to compose the error message and we have to raise an error to block the operation in this DBMS. In the second task, we have to create a trigger to prevent creation of a new subscription for a subscriber already having 10 or more books taken. The expected result is the next. The transaction should be aborted on attempt to violate the condition mentioned in the task, and also an appropriate message should be displayed. And you may see the example of such message here. With MySQL, we have to start with before insert trigger. In this block of code, we are not only checking if this rule is violated, but if it is, we are composing the error message. And if it isn't, the error message will be the empty string. Then we have to check if the length of error message is greater than 0. And if it is, we have to raise an error, and this is how we block the transaction in MySQL. The code of the next trigger is different from the previous trigger only with this word. The previous trigger was before insert, this trigger is before update. But the internal body of the trigger and the whole logic here is exactly the same as for the previous trigger. With Microsoft SQL Server, we shall block the operation if any record is violating that rule, or if no records are violating that rule, we shall allow that operation to continue. So here we are creating the instead of trigger, and inside we are declaring variables for bad records list and for our final message. Then we are composing the list of bad records, and we are checking if that list contains something. If it does, we have to compose our final message, we have to raise an error, and we have to roll back the whole transaction. But if the transaction was not aborted and we've gotten to this point, here we are allowing the insertion to identity field, and here we are executing the insert operation, and then disallowing the insertion on identity field. And that's all. And here is the attentiveness test. There is some issue with this trigger, so please pause the video and try to find that issue. With Oracle, the solution is that simple. We only have to create the trigger for insert and update operations. Inside the trigger we have to compose the list of bad records or make that list the empty string. And finally, if that string is not empty, we have to perform such an operation to raise an error and to block the whole transaction. Finally, we have to emphasize one typical mistake here. Many people try solving this task with after triggers, and that's extremely slow. That is why in all our solutions we were using either before triggers or instead of triggers, but never after triggers. And in the final task we have to create a trigger to prevent modifying a subscription from inactive state back to active. It asks from modifying this field from this value to this one. The expected result is that the transaction should be aborted on attempt to violate the condition mentioned in the task, and also a message should be displayed. It asks something like that. Unlike with previous solutions, here everything is simple. For MySQL we only have to create the before trigger. For each row, we only have to check the old and the new value of that field, and if these values violate the rule from the task, we have to compose error message, raise an error, and force MySQL to roll back the whole transaction. In Microsoft SQL Server, first we have to prevent situations of primary key update. That's because if the primary key is updated, we can no longer match old and new values of some fields. But if everything is okay with this condition, then we only have to create the list of our bad records. And if that list is not empty, we have to compose the final error message, then we have to raise an error, and we have to roll back the transaction. Finally, with Oracle, we follow MySQL approach. Here, for each row, we are checking the old and the new value for this field, and if these values violate that rule from the task, we have to perform such a command to raise an error and to force Oracle to roll back the whole transaction.